Static. Not the clean, digital hiss of a modern radio, but the deep, analog crawl of a vacuum tube dying in the dark. A low-frequency hum that vibrates against the back of your jaw, smelling faintly of ozone and old copper. If you are hearing this, you missed the turn at exit 44. You thought it was just a patch of black ice. You thought if you kept your hands at 10 and 2 and stared hard enough into the blowing snow, the highway would eventually straighten out. But the highway doesn't straighten out. It only loops back on itself, deeper into the basin, where the radios stop picking up towers and start picking up the things that ran out of road 40 years ago. Don't touch the dial. Don't check your mirrors. Just keep your eyes on the whiteout. The whiteout didn't just obscure the highway. It erased the geometry of the world. Inside the cab of the freight hauler, the heater clicked with a hollow, rhythmic tick that sounded less like a machine and more like an artificial pulse, keeping a dead system upright. Outside, Route 9A was a theoretical line through a void of packed snow and low-hanging gray pressing against the windshield like wet wool. Arthur adjusted his grip on the wheel, his knuckles gray under the dim amber dashboard glow. His eyes burned from 20 hours behind glass, staring into the blinding glare of high beams reflecting off blowing drifts. According to the dashboard clock, it was 3:14 a.m. According to his internal clock, time had stopped moving 20 miles back, trapped somewhere between a diner off exit 44 and this endless stretch of guardrails. The radio static hissed, a steady, low-frequency hum. He hadn't heard a human voice in 3 hours, just the low, atmospheric crunch of static and the occasional rhythmic pop of a failing vacuum tube inside the old analog unit mounted below the dash. Then the speaker cleared its throat. It wasn't a broadcast tower or a trucker 20 miles ahead. It was dry, precise, and entirely devoid of static, sounding less like a radio transmission and more like someone speaking directly into the hollow bone behind Arthur's ear. "Keep your hands at 10 and 2, the voice said. Arthur didn't jump. Extreme exhaustion short-circuits surprise, replacing shock with a heavy, leaden resignation. He simply stared through the frost-rimed glass at the swirling white void. "Stop blinking so fast," the voice continued, its cadence measured and entirely flat. "You haven't blinked in 42 seconds. Your eyes are drying out against the glass." Arthur blinked. The sudden sting of his eyelids scraping over dry corneas was sharp enough to water his eyes. He checked the dashboard. The radio was turned off. The physical toggle switch was firmly pushed down into the dead position, and the small green power indicator light was dark. Yet the voice remained, clear and close, hovering just inches from the back of his neck. He reached out with a stiff, gloved hand and flicked the dash heater fan up to high. The roar of the blower filled the cab, but the voice cut cleanly through the mechanical whine without missing a syllable. "You're gripping the wheel too tight. The metal is cold, but your hands are sweating. If you lose traction on this grade, correcting left puts you into the ravine. You already know what's at the bottom of the ravine, Arthur. We left it there 2 hours ago." Arthur's foot eased off the accelerator. The heavy diesel engine groaned, dropping 50 RPM. He looked down at the passenger seat. It was empty, cracked, and covered in a fine layer of dust. Nothing was sitting there. The impression of weight beside him, the faint depression in the cushion, the subtle displacement of cold air, was absolute. "Check your rear view," the voice whispered. Arthur's chin jerked upward. He flicked his gaze to the center rearview mirror. It didn't show the dark, empty aluminum box of the trailer stretching behind him. Instead, it showed the interior of the cab from a perspective that didn't exist, a camera angle hanging from the ceiling liner, looking down at the back of his head. In the reflection, something sat in the passenger seat, draped in a thick, wet canvas tarp that dripped dark, viscous fluid onto the floor mat. The tarp was shifting, undulating with a slow, rhythmic breath. "You passed the mile marker 4 minutes ago," the voice whispered, dropping an octave into a wet, gravelly rasp. "You missed it because you were looking at the road. But the road isn't going anywhere. It's just waiting for you to stop." The truck hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. The steering wheel violently wrenched out of Arthur's hands as the rig began to jackknife into the whiteout. The cab didn't spin. In a normal slide, centrifugal force throws you against the door. The tires scream, and your stomach hits your throat. This was different. The rig simply stopped moving forward while the universe rotated around it on a frictionless axis. The headlights swung in a wide, dizzying arc across the tree line, catching the jagged silhouettes of pine branches buried in snow before plunging into absolute dark. Arthur's hands froze on the dead wheel. The engine didn't roar. It died with a single wet cough, the tachometer needle dropping straight down to zero like a falling stone. The dash lights flickered once, twice, and then went entirely black, plunging the interior into a suffocating pitch-black velvet. There was no sound except for the ticking of the cooling exhaust manifold and the muffled, heavy drift of snow settling against the aluminum siding of the trailer 50 feet behind him. "You didn't countersteer," the voice said. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from right between his shoulder blades, pressed flat against the back of his canvas jacket. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He reached out blindly in the dark, his gloved fingers scraping across the dashboard, hunting for the emergency flasher switch or the plastic handle of the flashlight wedged in the side pocket. His hand hit metal, cold, greasy, and damp. It wasn't the dash. It was a knee, a bare, freezing knee bent at a sharp angle, resting on the floorboard directly between his boots. Arthur snatched his hand back, his heart slamming against his ribs like a caged bird. He tried to scream, but the air locked in his lungs, dry and tasting of copper and stale tobacco. "Don't look down," the voice whispered, right into the shell of his right ear. The breath was hot, smelling of stagnant river water and rotting wood, totally at odds with the sub-zero chill of the cab. "If you look down, you'll see where the seatbelt went. Or rather where it didn't go." Against every instinct of self-preservation, Arthur's head dropped an inch. Even in the pitch dark, his eyes were adjusting to the faint, phosphorescent glow reflecting off the snow outside. Down in the footwell, crossing diagonally across his chest and lap, the heavy nylon seatbelt wasn't buckled into the receiver on the wall. It was pulled taut, sinking deep into the fabric of his jacket, and continuing straight through his ribcage, emerging from his back to anchor itself to the empty frame of the passenger seat. He wasn't sitting in the driver's seat. Not anymore. "We've been sitting here a long time, Arthur," the voice said, shifting slightly, the leather of the seat groaning under a sudden, heavy transfer of weight. "Since the bridge collapsed, since the concrete gave way under the front axle. Don't you remember the sound the steel cables made when they snapped?" Violent concussion echoed through the metal frame of the truck. Clang-ga-ga, thump. It was the sound of a heavy weight hitting the roof of the cab. Then another, and another, like gravel being shoveled onto a tin shed, growing louder, heavier, until the roof panels began to buckle inward under an immense crushing load of wet earth and packed snow. "The plow is coming," the voice murmured, sounding almost gentle now. "They always clear this stretch by dawn, but they won't see the truck, Arthur. They never see what's already at the bottom." The cabin groaned as the weight overhead increased, the steel roof panels pressing down until they skimmed the top of Arthur's winter cap. Every rivet popped in sequence, a staccato string of small, metallic detonations that vibrated straight through his skull. He didn't move. He couldn't. His fingers remained locked onto the dead steering wheel, though the column itself felt different now. Not cold plastic and rubber, but rusted iron, rough and pitted with decades of stagnant moisture. "You always hated the night shifts," the voice whispered. It was closer now, the lips nearly brushing the cartilage of his ear. The voice didn't belong to a stranger anymore. It had a familiar timbre, worn down by cheap cigarettes and too many hours talking into an empty CB mic at 4 in the morning. It sounded like Arthur's own voice, recorded on a degraded cassette tape and played back at half speed. Always complaining about the mileage, always talking about quitting once the seasonal contract cleared. Arthur's mouth parted, his lips cracking in the dry, dead air of the cab. "I did quit," he rasped. The sound of his own voice felt alien, thin and paper dry, as if it had traveled a long distance to get out of his throat. "Nobody quits the route, Arthur," the voice replied softly. "You just reached the end of the line we laid out for you." Outside, the wind dropped away instantly. The howling whiteout vanished, replaced by an absolute suffocating dead silence. No engine ticks, no wind against the aluminum trailer. Just the steady wet drip of melting ice somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. Plip, 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 hitting stagnant water with the cadence of a metronome. Arthur tilted his head downward again, forcing his eyes to pierce the velvet dark of the footwell. The bare knee he had touched a moment ago was still there, wedged between his boots. But as his eyes adjusted further, he saw the skin. It wasn't just cold, it was gray, waterlogged, and bloated, the flesh translucent enough to show the dark, sluggish network of veins beneath the surface. It was a leg that had spent a very long time submerged in silt, and it was wearing the exact same brown work boot with the frayed yellow lace that Arthur had laced up at the truck stop 12 hours ago. Or was it 12 years ago? "Lift your hands," the voice commanded. The tone lost its conversational warmth, snapping tight with sudden heavy authority. "The grade is steepening. If you don't brake now, we're going to hit the curve." Arthur's fingers refused to obey. They were fused to the iron wheel, the skin of his palms sticking to the oxidized metal as if cold welded by frost. "I can't," he whispered. "I know," the voice sighed right against his neck. "That's why I have to do it for you." A pair of hands, heavy, sodden and freezing cold, slid out from the empty space behind the driver's seat. They crossed over Arthur's shoulders, the long, swollen fingers digging hard into the muscles of his chest. Before he could draw another breath, those cold hands slammed down brutally onto his wrists, prying his fingers off the wheel, one by one, with the dry, splintering crack of frozen bone snapping under pressure. The pain didn't hit immediately. Extreme cold and total shock have a way of buffering the nervous system, turning bone breaks into a dull, distant crunch like dry twigs snapping beneath a boot. Arthur watched, or felt, through the weirdly detached lens of his own perception, his hands fold backward at unnatural angles as the unseen entity behind him forced them off the iron steering wheel. The fingers hung loose, twitching once or twice like severed wires connected to a dying battery, completely unresponsive to any command from his brain. "There," the voice whispered, the wet breath warm against the freezing skin of his neck now. "Much better. You don't need to steer anymore, Arthur. The vehicle knows where it belongs." The truck lurched forward. There was no engine roar, no rumble of diesel combustion, but the landscape outside the frost-caked windshield began to move again. It didn't glide. It slid sideways with a sickening, grinding shudder, as if the heavy rig were being dragged across a floor paved with broken bottles and jagged scrap metal. Arthur's eyes strained against the dark. The whiteout had vanished, replaced by a low amber twilight that seemed to emanate from the snow itself. Through the windshield, the guardrails of Route 9A were gone. In their place stood towering walls of ice, deep, glacier-blue monoliths streaked with veins of black silt and frozen debris. Trapped inside the ice, clearly visible just inches from the glass, were the shapes of other vehicles. A rusted pickup truck from the 70s, a battered commercial van with its doors blown inward, and inside each one, staring back through the frost with vacant, milky eyes, sat a driver slumped over a dead wheel. "We're passing the others," the voice murmured, its tone shifting into something almost conversational, like an old friend pointing out landmarks on a familiar morning commute. "Number 44, number 45. You remember 45, don't you? That was the year the bridge icing took out the whole northbound convoy." Arthur tried to shut his eyes, but his eyelids wouldn't close. The cartilage had stiffened, frozen open by the draft leaking through the buckled door seals. He was forced to watch as the ice walls slid past, a silent gallery of forgotten wrecks sinking deeper into the permafrost. "Look closer," the voice commanded sharply, the cold hands on his chest tightening their grip, pressing inward until his ribs groaned. "Look at the cab of the van." Arthur's gaze jerked toward the glass. Pressed flat against the passenger side window of the commercial van was a face. The skin was bleached white by water, hair floating in a halo of frozen slurry, mouth open in a permanent silent shout. It was a face he knew. It was the face from his own driver's license photo, the one issued 10 years ago in a different state, under a different name, before he took the long-haul routes that never turned back around. "You've been driving a long time, Arthur," the voice whispered, a note of genuine pity weaving through the gravelly rasp. "Longer than the truck's odometer can count. Every time you hit that patch of black ice on exit 44, you thought you corrected. You thought you made it through." A sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the cabin, drowning out the sound of the grinding ice, It was the sound of glass under terminal tension, a microscopic fracture spreading across the windshield, splitting into a spiderweb of fine, glittering lines right between Arthur's eyes. The spiderweb crack across the windshield didn't stay internal. With a dry, brittle snap, the glass yielded, and the vacuum inside the cab instantly ruptured. There was no rush of freezing wind. Instead, a heavy, silent wave of black river water poured through the gap, spilling over the dashboard in a thick, sluggish sheet. It didn't splash or spray. It moved with the oily deliberation of liquid lead, filling the footwell in seconds and rising past the pedals, past the seat cushions, until it soaked into the collar of Arthur's jacket. Arthur didn't choke. When the water hit his chin and rose past his lips, his lungs didn't spasm for air. There was nothing left inside him to breathe, only the stale, dry memory of oxygen that had run out miles back. "Keep your mouth shut," the voice whispered, bubbling up directly through the dark water pressing against his throat. "If you let it in, you'll start remembering the rest of it, and we aren't ready for the bridge yet." The truck tilted downward at a sharp, sickening angle. The horizontal world dissolved entirely as the heavy rig nosed straight down into a deep subterranean basin. The amber twilight of the glacier walls faded into an absolute lightless abyss, where the only illumination came from the faint, sickly green glow of the dashboard clock, its digital numbers frozen permanently at 3:14 a.m. Through the murky water swirling around his chest, Arthur watched his own hands, still bent and broken at the wrists, float upward toward the ruined windshield. They didn't drift like dead weight. They moved with a precise, automatic grace, the stiff fingers tracing the jagged edges of the broken glass as if inspecting a finished repair job. "Look at the floor," the voice murmured, right beside his ear. The sound had changed. It no longer echoed inside the cab. It sounded open, vast and heavy, as if spoken from the bottom of an immense silent lake. Arthur looked down. The metal floorboards of the freight hauler had rusted away entirely, replaced by a thick carpet of dark, tangled silt. And half buried in the mud beneath the pedals was a heavy iron chain, its links crusted with zebra mussels and old paint flakes. One end was bolted securely to the truck's frame. The other disappeared downward into the black floor of the basin, stretching away into a depth that had no bottom. "That's what held us," the voice said quietly. "Every time you thought you were gaining miles on the route, the chain just spooled out a little further, letting you think you were heading home." A dull, rhythmic thud echoed from the rear of the trailer. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of snow or gravel anymore. It was the heavy, waterlogged impact of 50 feet of aluminum box striking the riverbed, settling deep into the mud as the entire rig completed its final, unbroken descent. The stillness at the bottom of the basin wasn't the quiet of a resting place. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of something held underwater by immense, deliberate force. Inside the cab, the water had settled into a stagnant equilibrium, hovering just an inch below the lower rim of Arthur's eyes. Every bubble had long since vanished. The air trapped against the ceiling was thin, cold, and tasted intensely of rusted iron and old paper that had sat damp for decades in a forgotten locker. Arthur's head remained locked forward, his neck rigid. The voice was quiet now, reduced to a low, vibrating hum that lived entirely within the bones of his skull. "Reach into the glove box," the voice instructed. The command wasn't harsh. It carried the tired mechanical patience of a dispatcher running through a mandatory checklist at the end of a 16-hour rotation. Arthur's right arm twitched. The broken wrist didn't protest. The nerves had long since traded pain for a numb, heavy density like lead pipe. His fingers, stiff and swollen inside the wet leather of his work glove, drifted across the cracked vinyl of the dashboard until they brushed against the recessed latch of the glove compartment. Click. The plastic door dropped open with a sluggish motion, slowed by the dense water pressing against it. A single object slid out from the dark interior, tumbling slowly through the murky fluid before landing squarely in Arthur's lap. It wasn't a flashlight. It wasn't a spare pack of cigarettes or a roll of electrical tape. It was a standard Department of Transportation driver's logbook, bound in cracked black leather, with the corners swollen and frayed from prolonged water exposure. The elastic band used to hold it shut had rotted away into a string of black mush, leaving the cover slightly parted, revealing thick pages warped and crusted with white mineral deposits. "Open it," the voice whispered. Arthur's fingers moved without his consent, hooking beneath the soggy cardboard cover and flipping it back. The pages didn't rustle. They separated with a soft, tearing sound like wet tissue paper. The handwriting on the topmost page was neat, precise, and unmistakably his own, written in black ballpoint ink that hadn't run or smeared, protected somehow by the dense stagnant air trapped between the leaves. Route 9A. Shift start. 3:14 a.m. Conditions: heavy snow, zero visibility. Cargo: unaccounted. Notes: missed the turn at exit 44, again. Arthur scanned down the column of dates, his eyes jumping from row to row. There weren't 20 entries or 300, or even a few years' worth of shifts. The page stretched downward in an infinite micro-printed grid that repeated the exact same lines, the exact same timestamp, the exact same notation of failure, stretching back across columns that predated the highway, the truck, and the asphalt itself. "You see?" The voice murmured, a faint, dry chuckle rattling in the space behind his ribs. "You never left the yard, Arthur. You just kept writing the same night over and over until the ink soaked all the way through to the other side." At the bottom of the page, beneath the endless repetition of his own signature, a fresh line of ink began to form on its own. The ballpoint pen wasn't in his hand. It was pressing directly onto the soggy paper from beneath, driven upward by an unseen finger pushing through the back of the logbook. Shift end, pending. The ink on the bottom page didn't stop bleeding. It soaked outward from the tip of the phantom pen, the dark fluid spreading across the warped paper in jagged, branching fingers that looked less like handwriting and more like a root system finding purchase in damp soil. "Turn the page," the voice said. Arthur's thumb caught the corner of the soggy leaf. The paper felt heavy, coated in a fine layer of silt that left a gray smudge on his glove. When he lifted it, the page beneath didn't reveal a new set of numbers or a continuation of the log. It revealed a map. It was hand-drawn in faded blue grease pencil on grid paper, its edges stained with grease and dried coffee rings. At the top, written in that same precise mechanical hand, was a single heading: Exit 44, alternate route. Arthur stared at the lines. Route 9A wasn't a straight line anymore. It curled inward like a coiled spring, folding back upon itself in a series of concentric loops that centered on a single black square marked with an X. "You always thought the detour was a mistake," the voice murmured, close enough that he could feel the cold draft lifting the hairs on the back of his neck. "Every time the dispatcher called over the radio, telling you to take the secondary grade off the highway, you thought it was a clerical error, a bad dispatch, a typo in the manifest." The dashboard clock flickered. The glowing green numbers, 314, suddenly shifted, the digits blurring together like melting wax before reforming into a new set, 315. For the first time since the truck hit the ice, the digital colon between the numbers didn't blink. It stayed solid, a fixed barrier holding time in place. Outside the broken windshield, the dark, stagnant water of the basin began to thin. The heavy, lightless void parted, replaced by the faint, sickly yellow glow of a single overhead sodium vapor lamp swinging on a rusted iron chain. The truck wasn't at the bottom of a river anymore. Through the cracked glass, Arthur could see the silhouette of a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, sagging beneath the weight of accumulated snow. Beyond the fence sat a small, corrugated metal guard shack with a yellowed plastic sign hanging crookedly above the door. Depth of transportation, District 4, Maintenance Yard. The gate was open, held back by a concrete block half buried in ice. "You made your deliveries, Arthur," the voice whispered, the gravelly rasp turning low and rhythmic, like tires rolling over a cattle guard. "Every box was accounted for. Every weight ticket was signed, but you forgot to log the return trip." The heavy diesel engine beneath the hood didn't roar to life. It gave a single hollow cough, and the tachometer needle jumped from 0 back up to 600 RPM. The steering wheel twitched in his broken hands, the oxidized metal warming slightly under his palms as the front tires caught traction on gravel. The truck began to roll forward, not fast, but with an inexorable heavy drag, pulling away from the riverbed and heading straight toward the open gate of the maintenance yard. The truck rolled through the open chain-link gate with the slow, metallic drag of heavy iron scraping across frozen gravel. There was no sound of tires on asphalt. only the rhythmic crunch 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 of frozen earth collapsing beneath dual-wheel tread, steady and unyielding. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the guard shack ahead. The structure was a weathered square of corrugated aluminum, its walls stained with rust streaks that bled downward from the roofline like dried tears. A single naked incandescent bulb hung from a frayed cord inside the small window, casting a jaundiced, flickering circle of light over a wooden desk and an empty plastic chair. "Slow down," the voice whispered. The tone was no longer right behind his ear. It echoed slightly, bouncing off the narrow metal walls of the cab, as if the voice was expanding, filling the entire space between the windshield and the back bulkhead. "You have to sign out before you drop the key." The truck didn't wait for his permission. The air brake valves released with a sharp, hissing expulsion of compressed moisture. Tss! And the heavy rig ground to a halt precisely 3 feet from the wooden steps of the shack. The engine idled down, settling into a low, rhythmic vibration that shook the gearshift knob against Arthur's knee. "Go on," the voice urged, softer now, carrying the exhausted cadence of a shift supervisor finishing a double. "They've been holding the ledger open since 3:14. Arthur's right hand lifted from the steering wheel. The broken wrist didn't ache. It swung loosely like a hinged gate, guiding his arm across the cracked vinyl seat toward the passenger door. His gloved fingers wrapped around the interior handle and pulled. The door didn't swing outward into the snow. It dropped away with a heavy, rusted thud, falling flat onto the frozen gravel outside. Instead of freezing winter air, a dense wave of dry, overheated indoor air billowed into the cab. It smelled of ozone, cheap instant coffee, and the distinct, papery dust of a room that hadn't seen an open window in 40 years. Arthur leaned forward, his torso pivoting on an axis that felt entirely mechanical. He stepped out of the cab, his heavy work boot descending not into snow, but onto a linoleum floor speckled with cigarette burns and grease spots. The door of the guard shack was already open, creaking slowly on a single ungreased hinge. Inside, the room was agonizingly small. A green metal desk sat beneath the yellow window, covered in neat, orderly stacks of duplicate forms, a black rotary telephone with the cord cut, and an open ledger book, bound in cracking black buckram. Sitting in the metal chair behind the desk was a man wearing a grease-stained Department of Transportation canvas jacket. His head was bowed low over the open pages of the ledger. A short, stub graphite pencil gripped tightly in fingers that were gray, water-swollen, and stiff. He didn't look up when Arthur stepped across the threshold. "You're late, Arthur," the man said. The voice didn't come from the radio, and it didn't come from behind his ear. It came from the throat of the man at the desk, a man whose face, when he finally tilted his chin upward into the harsh yellow light, bore the exact same jagged industrial thread seam across the mouth that Arthur had seen beneath the tarp in the rearview mirror. Arthur looked down at his own hands. The work gloves were gone. In their place were gray, water-soaked fingers, dripping a slow, thick stream of dark river silt onto the clean paper of the desk. The air inside the guard shack didn't circulate. It hung suspended, thick with the dry, baked-in scent of old tobacco and carbon paper that had been sitting under a hot, incandescent bulb since before the highway was paved. Arthur stood over the green metal desk. His boots didn't make a sound on the scuffed linoleum, though every time he shifted his weight, the floorboards beneath the desk groaned with a deep wooden complaint, like the ribs of an old hull settling into a mud bank. The man sitting in the metal chair, the one with the heavy canvas jacket, and the thick industrial thread sealing his lips in a jagged vertical line, did not move his head again. He simply sat motionless, his gray, waterlogged hand still gripping the short stub of graphite pencil, its tip resting on an empty line at the bottom of the open ledger. "Sign the manifest," the voice rasped. It wasn't coming from the room's corners anymore. It vibrated up through the wood of the desk, humming against Arthur's belt buckle, like the idle of a diesel engine ticking over at low RPM. Arthur looked down at the ledger. The pages were old, the paper yellowed and brittle at the margins, covered in rows of neat, identical handwriting, column after column of route numbers, mileage counts, cargo weights, and timestamps. Every single entry bore the exact same date. Every single entry was stamped with the exact same time, 3:14 a.m., and at the end of every row, written in sharp, precise black ink, was a signature. Arthur Vance. Except it wasn't just his signature. As he stared closer, the letters began to shift and separate, resolving into microscopic repetitions of the same sentence, written over and over in the margins. We never reached the exit. We never reached the exit. We never reached the exit. I have to get back to the rig, Arthur said. His voice sounded thin, like paper tearing in another room. The words felt strange in his throat, dry and unused, as if he hadn't spoken aloud since the truck crossed the county line 12 hours or 12 years ago. The man behind the desk didn't blink. He couldn't. His eyelids were pulled tight, stitched shut at the corners with the same heavy waxed cord that closed his mouth. The rig is unloaded, Arthur, the voice replied, low and steady. The trailer was empty when we hit the bridge. It's been empty since the day we signed the lease. A sharp metallic clink echoed from outside the shack. Arthur's head jerked toward the window. Through the yellowed, grease-filmed glass, the freight hauler sat idling in the empty maintenance yard. But the trailer, the 50-foot aluminum box that should have stretched out behind the cab, was gone. The tractor unit ended abruptly at the fifth wheel. The locking jaws clamped around nothing at all, dripping dark, stagnant river water onto the frozen gravel. Inside the empty cab, through the passenger side window, something was sitting on the cracked vinyl seat. It was draped in a wet canvas tarp, shifting and undulating with a slow, heavy breath. You left the door open on the way down, the man at the desk murmured, his graphite pencil tapping once against the paper. Tick. The water got into the wiring. That's why the radio wouldn't shut off. Arthur reached out, his fingers stiff and gray, closed around the stub of the pencil resting on the ledger. The wood felt cold, waterlogged and slick with a fine film of silt. Sign out, the voice commanded. The pencil moved. Arthur didn't feel his hand guiding it, but the graphite caught the paper, scratching a deep, jagged line across the final empty row of the logbook. The lead tore through the old paper, biting straight into the wood of the desk beneath, carving a single, permanent mark that couldn't be erased. The tear in the paper didn't rip through to the desk. It caught on the iron grain, leaving a dark, jagged groove that smelled of scorched resin and river mud. Arthur let go of the pencil. His fingers remained curved into the shape of the wood, stiff and waterlogged, the skin translucent enough to reveal the pale gray bones underneath. He didn't pull his hand away. He stared down at the name he had written in the ledger, Arthur Vance, watching as the ink spread inward, sinking deep into the grain until the letters turned the color of dried rust. Good, the man behind the desk whispered. The sound was dry, like corn husks rubbing together in a November wind. Now we can check the manifest. Arthur's head turned, his neck making a low grinding sound like ungreased ball bearings. Through the grease-filmed window of the guard shack, the freight hauler sat alone in the center of the frosted asphalt yard. The fifth wheel was still clamped around nothing, dripping that thick, oily water onto the frozen ground. But the space behind the cab wasn't empty anymore. The air above the chassis was rippling, bending the yellow light of the overhead sodium lamp like heat rising off hot asphalt in July. A shape formed there, slowly at first, then with a sudden sickening density. It wasn't metal, it wasn't freight. It was a stack of wooden crates, bound with rusted steel strapping, piled high enough to match the height of the missing aluminum trailer. The wood was old, water-swollen, and coated in a thick, gray crust of freshwater mussels and dead river moss. You always wondered what was in the back, the voice said, echoing softly from the corners of the small room. It wasn't coming from the man at the desk anymore. It rattled the corrugated aluminum walls of the shack. You thought it was electronics. You thought it was dry goods for the stores off exit 44. You never checked the seal on the back doors. Arthur stepped back from the desk. His boots made a wet, heavy suction sound, peeling up from the linoleum with every movement. He didn't want to look at the crates. Every instinct built into his marrow told him to stay inside the stale, warm air of the guard shack, to keep his eyes fixed on the green metal desk, to pretend the yard outside didn't exist. But his body wasn't his own anymore. It was just a vehicle, an old rig running on fumes, caught in a loop it couldn't steer out of. His shoulders rotated. His stiff legs carried him toward the open door. The cold air hit him immediately, a heavy, damp chill tasting of stagnant water, dead weeds, and bottom-feeding silt. It was the smell of the river 50 feet below the bridge, where the guardrails had given way 12 hours or 12 decades ago. Arthur walked down the 2 wooden steps of the guard shack. His boots hit the frozen gravel of the maintenance yard. The gravel was gone. Instead of hard stones, his feet sank ankle-deep into thick, cold mud that sucked at his ankles with greedy, deliberate weight. The chain-link fence was gone too. In its place, towering walls of gray, frozen earth rose up on either side of the yard, sealing the perimeter with jagged blocks of ice and exposed tree roots hanging like dead hair. The freight hauler sat right in front of him, half submerged in the mire up to the running boards. Resting squarely on the frame where the trailer should have been was a single open wooden crate, its lid ripped away to reveal what was packed inside. Arthur stopped 3 feet from the chassis. His breath didn't fog in the cold air, his lungs were empty, filled only with the silence of the basin. Inside the rotting wooden crate, neatly arranged in rows beneath a thin film of black water, were dozens of heavy glass jars. And floating inside every single jar, preserved in cloudy, yellowed formalin beneath a rusted metal lid, was a human hand, each one locked in a rigid, desperate grip, fingers curled inward, as if trying to hold onto a steering wheel that wasn't there. Arthur stared down into the open wooden crate, his reflection wavering slightly in the stagnant water pooled across the tops of the glass jars. The formalin inside was a sickly, jaundiced yellow, thick with floating sediment that drifted like disturbed ash. Each jar contained a hand. Some were small, smooth-skinned, and delicate, belonging to drivers who had taken the route decades ago. Others were scarred, calloused, and blackened by coal dust or machine grease. But every single one shared a uniform, unsettling geometry. The right hand, severed cleanly at the wrist, fingers locked in a permanent, white-knuckled claw. "You look for yours," the voice whispered. It didn't come from the air or the cab now. It resonated directly from inside the crate, bubbling up through the water like air escaping a sunken lung. Row 4, slot 12, under the rust-stained lid with the bent wire bail. Arthur's right arm twitched. The broken wrist, stiff, cold, and entirely devoid of living blood, swung outward. His fingers descended into the murky liquid, brushing past cold grass until they hit a jar near the back corner of the crate. His hand curled around the damp, rusted metal lid. With a dry, squeaking twist that set his teeth on edge, the lid gave way. A puff of ancient, pressurized gas escaped the jar, a sharp, sweet scent of formaldehyde and rotting vegetation that made his throat tighten. Arthur tilted the jar, pouring a stream of yellowed fluid and sediment across his palm. A hand slid out, landing heavily against his own fingers. It was gray, waterlogged, and bloated. The skin was translucent enough to trace the dark network of veins beneath the surface, and on the ring finger, catching the dim, sickly amber light of the overhead lamp, was a heavy silver band scored with a deep, jagged scratch across the metal. It was his ring, the one he had slipped onto his finger 20 years ago, before the first winter storm, before the bridge gave way, before the logbook started repeating the same hour over and over again. "It doesn't fit anymore, does it?" the voice murmured. Arthur tried to press the severed hand back against his wrist, attempting to line up the ragged, bone-white edges where the flesh had been torn away. But there was no pulse to knit the tissue back together, no warmth to coax the cold meat into life. The hand simply slipped off his forearm, dropping back into the dark water of the crate with a dull, heavy splash. "The delivery is complete, Arthur," the voice said, its tone shifting, dropping the weary cadence of a supervisor and turning crisp, sharp, and final. "Signatures match, cargo accounted for. All that's left is to clear the bay." Behind him, the diesel engine of the freight hauler roared to life for the first time. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like an immense iron heart starting up after a century in the dark. The roar of the diesel engine didn't shake the frozen earth. It rattled straight through Arthur's marrow, a low mechanical vibration that dissolved the cold mud around his boots. The freight hauler surged forward without a driver, its dual wheels biting into the gray silt as the heavy tractor unit pulled away from the rotting crate and headed straight for the far wall of the basin. There was no braking. There was no hesitation. The truck accelerated with terrifying, unnatural speed, its high beams cutting twin beams of brilliant, blinding white through the gloom. Arthur stood alone beside the crate, his arms hanging loose at his sides, watching the red tail lights shrink into the distance. "Walk," the voice whispered. It wasn't inside his head anymore. It came from everywhere. From the frozen earth, from the dripping ice overhead, from the dark, infinite stretch of the highway unfolding just beyond the reach of the headlights. Arthur took a step, then another. His legs didn't feel heavy now. The waterlogged numbness had vanished, replaced by a strange, weightless clarity. As he walked down the center of the muddy grade, the towering walls of ice and frozen earth began to slide backward, melting away into the gray mist of a pre-dawn horizon. The road beneath his boots changed. The mud gave way to packed snow, then slush, and finally smooth, black asphalt that glistened beneath a cold, indifferent winter sky. Ahead of him, brake lights flared red in the distance. A large freight hauler sat parked on the shoulder of Route 9A, its engine idling softly in the quiet air. The hazard flashers blinked in a steady, rhythmic pulse, amber light cutting through the blowing snow. Arthur walked up to the passenger door, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal handle. He pulled it open, climbed into the cab, and pulled himself up onto the cracked vinyl seat. The interior was warm, smelling faintly of stale tobacco and coffee. He closed the door, shutting out the wind. On the dashboard, the clock glowed bright green. The digits flickered once, twice, and settled. 3:14 a.m. Arthur reached out with steady hands, gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and shifted the heavy rig back into drive. Ahead of him, the highway stretched out into the dark, perfectly straight, waiting for the first mile marker to appear. The engine idles down. The digital clock settles at 3:14 a.m. If you listen closely, past the hum of the heater, past the rhythmic drip of water hitting the floorboards, you can hear it. The faint, high-pitched scratching of a pen on dry paper. A name being written at the bottom of a manifest that has no final page. Thank you for riding with Halfway Dark. Make sure your doors are locked and your high beams are on, because somewhere up ahead, the next shift is starting.